In this chapter, we're going to talk initially about basic functions of managing people. In the second part of this video, we'll talk a little bit more detail about business plans and starting up businesses. So let's continue into this chapter. So the basic concept or definition of management is it's a process. It's a process that you work through to try to manage or to achieve goals through direction and to achieve these goals efficiently and effectively. So there are 5 basic functions: planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling operations. So these can sometimes be combined together, sometimes they can be separated. One of the things that you'll find in many of my videos is there are, in many of these lectures, is that there are lectures, and we may watch these during class, but anytime that you're watching this video, if you click on this, you can do control click and it will open it. It's a YouTube video, and I usually give you a time signature so you won't be watching a 3-hour lecture outside of the class. So again, this is again a fairly nice short description. It doesn't exactly match up with the 5 that we have here, but all of them are incorporated into the discussion for that this particular video. So the first idea, the first concept is planning. We have 2 forms of planning. Strategic planning is a future vision, if you will. Where do we want the company to go moving forward? Where would we like to be in 5 years? Where would we like to be in 10 years? Functional planning is a more micro kind of a plan. It is part of the organization of how to achieve the strategic plan. And I think the bottom sentence here is kind of important, not just for beginning business, but for anything that we do in life, right? Nobody begins a business with a plan for failure, but frequently businesses are started without or have been started with a failure to plan. Excuse me. A second function, if you will, is goal setting. We have to have some vision, right? You have to have some measurable, achievable time frame that these types of objectives or the planning pieces of the business will happen. Now, for goals to really be goals, goals must be written down. You have to have goals written or they are just pipe dreams. So we have to be able to identify exactly what these are. And I don't want to make this sound very trivial. It's a very important part in life, whether it's business or your own personal dealings with the world, right? If you have goals, they're not really goals unless you can write them down. They're not really goals unless you can measure them and understand what their achievement means. For a for-profit organization, the primary goals might be to maximize the wealth of its owners over the life of the business. Meeting interest payments on debt are certainly important. To grow the company is certainly important. What do you think the goals for a not-for-profit should be? Well, there's no owner, so there's no real wealth to build, but certainly you might want to make interest payments. You certainly might want to grow. And I might say, instead of maximizing the wealth of the business owners, you need to have a cash flow stream that exceeds the expenses of the companies. So even not-for-profit companies have to have more cash inflow than they have cash outflow. So again, the difference between goals and objectives: goals are typically more long-term, and objectives are those intermediate kinds of things, more short-term, that measure progress towards the overall goals. Organizing is a second function of the manager, right? We need to identify, right, who's going to do things, what skills do they need, what time frame are we concerned about, right? Where's all this going to be accomplished? How's it going to get accomplished, right? How do we identify and how do we define the actual structure of the business? This is where we're actually going to say, okay, this is my business and this is how I'm going to do the business. So once we know what the organization is going to look like, then we can start talking about staffing, right? This is where we're going to find those people to help us with our goals, with our objectives. So we need to find who's going to staff the company. What are the job requirements going to be? Maybe we need to develop job descriptions, right? So all of these things are obviously what? It's part of the management function to identify goals, figure out how those goals should be made, and then find the people to do those goals. In the end, they talk about something called directing, which is leading, right? Somebody has to be the engine of this train, right? Somebody has to be the person that is driving the organization, that's providing the guidance, providing the information necessary for people to accomplish the organization's mission. Controlling is kind of like the last of these functions, right? It's a three-step process. We have to establish metrics, a standard of measurement. We need to measure that against the actual performance, against these standards, and then fix it. This is really the implementation and monitoring process that is some people refer to this as being closing the loop, right? You set objectives that are measurable, you perform the task, you measure the outcome of the task, and you compare that outcome to some preconceived standard that you wanted to meet. Then you repeat it all over again. Fix things that are not working well, and then enhance things that are working well. What I would suggest is this is a video by John Maxwell, and John Maxwell is a speaker, talks a lot about leadership, and I think this will give you a great deal of insight into a little bit more about what being a leader is. There certainly are different levels, different types of people. And I find him very interesting. He's humorous at times. Not truly what you might call an academic. But his discussions are anecdotal. They are insightful. And I think they can give us a little picture of how the world might actually work. So again, it's obviously 27 minutes. So, at your leisure, I find this particular video to be very helpful. So moving on, we want to talk about how you're going to form a business, or how businesses are formed. And if you look at this, the pie here, you can see that 71% of all businesses are proprietorships. Another 10% are partnerships. Another 13% so are S corporations. These all pretty much, at least with respect to taxation, these three all form or act fairly similarly. Corporations are a very small part, right? Only 6% of all of the businesses are C Corps. So how does a person choose which one of these things they want to be if they start a business? So let's talk about the different forms. A sole proprietorship is a company that's operated by an individual for profit, right? The downside of being a sole proprietor is that essentially you're on your own. You have to provide your own funding. We're going to talk a little bit about risk a little bit later. But all of these characteristics, when a person starts a business, they typically start as a sole proprietorship. A partnership is just a sole proprietor that has more than one owner. So there's more than one person in the business. Now, how this is created is kind of important because it determines how much money can be invested, and it also defines how much work the owner can do. So in a general partnership, everybody works together and everybody is responsible for the business. In a limited partnership, there typically are one or two, maybe general partners, people that essentially run the business. And in a limited partnership, everybody else essentially is what we would refer to as being silent partners. Now, we also have something called limited liability partnerships. This is just a version, if you will, of a combination of partnerships that can be created. A corporation, everybody has heard of a corporation, but essentially it's a corporation is a business that's a legal entity. It looks just and acts just like a person acts. About the only thing they can't do that a person can do is vote. So we have public corporations where stock's sold to the public, and we have private corporations where it's not sold to the public. These might be small companies. They could be family-owned companies, but they're very small and they don't necessarily trade to the public. Now, when these private corporations start to grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually they may need to go public so that they can acquire the funds to continue their growth. There are other things, something called a Subchapter S corporation. A Subchapter S corporation, it's a private corporation. It has special tax status. Essentially, it's taxed like a sole proprietorship or a partnership, but it has to be small. It has to be a maximum of 100 shareholders. You avoid some of the taxation issues that are associated with a corporation. Another form of business that's a rather new form is something called a limited liability company. This is a hybrid business. It has parts of the things from partnerships and it has some characteristics of corporations. It's taxed as a partnership, but it has limited liability. And again, we'll discuss limited liability in a few moments. In this case, the flows of income and losses go right to the owner. They don't go to the corporation. So this avoids some of the tax issues of being a corporation and how corporations are ultimately taxed. A franchise really isn't an actual form of an ownership. It's just a type of business that you can buy. You buy the right to sell some goods and services, but you buy it from a company. That company in return provides certain levels of training, certain levels of marketing. Many big companies that you can think of, especially in the food service industry, are franchises. If you wanted to explore this, and in class we'll probably take a look at this, you can go out to this website. It's called www.businessbroker.net, and you can explore some of the franchise opportunities that are available. you can actually sort them and filter them by how much money you might have. So if you have $40,000 that you'd like to invest in a business, then you can sort, and there's a little drop down box. You can tell it how much money you're willing to invest, and it will give you a list of all the franchises in the state in which you live that are available in that price range. So it's a nice little filter, if you will, to see what kind of businesses are available. Not-for-profits, as again we talked about, certainly they're not run as a business, but essentially they still have to have more cash inflow than outflow. Now, the overall mission or vision of not-for-profits are typically more public-oriented, right? They're typically service kinds of organizations that are provide some type of a service, like the Red Cross is a not-for-profit. So these, again, they're run as businesses, but they certainly have different missions and vision statements than a company like a restaurant or something might have. So that's the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to explore a little bit more about what business forms you might want to choose, and then we'll also talk about the components of a business plan.